35. The next day the barbarian assault slackened, and the Carthaginian force then reunited and made it through the pass. They suffered losses in the process, but more pack animals were killed than men. After this, the mountain men were less in evidence, and they made predatory raids on the head or the rear of the column, rather than real strikes, wherever the terrain offered an opportunity, or where they could take advantage of some of the Carthaginians going too far ahead or lagging behind. The elephants could be driven only at a snail's pace because the paths were steep and narrow, but they also provided security from the enemy all the way along. Unfamiliar with the beast, they feared to come too close to them. On the 9th day they reached the crest of the Alps. They had wandered around over mostly trackless terrain because of the duplicity of their guides, or because, distrusting the guides, they strayed blindly into gorges while guessing their way. They encamped on the crest for 2 days, and the soldiers, exhausted from their exertions and fighting, were given a rest. A number of pack animals that had fallen along the rocky path reached this camp by following the tracks of the column. The men were sick and tired of all the tribulations, and then a snowfall arrived, for it was now the setting of the constellation Pleiades, filling them with a new and terrible fear. A deep layer of snow covered the entire landscape, and when they struck camp at dawn the column moved sluggishly, with despondency and despair written on every face. Hannibal rode ahead of the standards and ordered his men to halt on a spur that afforded a deep and broad panorama. Here he pointed out to them Italy and the plains that surrounded the Po at the foot of the Alps. At that moment he told them they were crossing the defenses not merely of Italy, but of the city of Rome. The rest of the way would be flat or downhill, 1 or at most 2 battles, and they would have that chief bastion of Italy in their hands and at their mercy. The column went ahead, and now, apart from some stealthy attacks, the enemy did not even take advantage of opportunities to harass them. But the journey was much harder than on the way up, the Alpine slopes on the Italian side being as a rule shorter but also steeper. Almost every step of the way was steep, narrow, and slippery. As a result, the men could not keep from falling, and even after losing their balance only slightly, they could not, once in difficulties, keep their footing, so that they would fall over each other, and the pack animals would fall on the men. 36. They next came to a much narrower passageway on the rock face, where the cliff fell away so steeply that a soldier, free of baggage, could barely make it down by feeling his way and clinging with his hands, and shrubs and roots protecting round about him. The spot had been naturally steep before, but it had now also been sheared off by a recent landslide, which had created a drop of fully 1,000 feet. The cavalry halted at this point, thinking they had reached the end of the road, and as Hannibal wondered what was holding up the column, word that the cliff was impassable was brought back to him. He then went off to examine the location for himself. It seemed clear to him that he had to take the column round on a detour, no matter how long it might be, through the surrounding areas, where there was no path, and no one had set foot before. But that avenue proved impossible too. Over an old, untouched layer of snow there was a fresh one of some slight depth. On this layer, since it was soft and not too deep, the feet of the marching men could get a footing, but then it melted, as all the men and pack animals walked over it, and the soldiers began to find themselves stepping on the glare ice that lay beneath, and on the slush of the thawing snow. This produced a horrific struggle. The slippery path afforded no foothold, and on the incline it made the feet slide all the more quickly, if they used hands or knees to help themselves up. These supports themselves would slither away from under them, and they would fall again. And there were no stumps or roots around to provide leverage for either foot or hand, only glare ice and slushy snow on which they simply slithered about. The pack animals treading the snow would occasionally cut even into the bottom layer. They would then slip forward, and, with their hooves flailing more wildly in their efforts to get up, would break right through. As a result, a number became wedged in the ice, which was hardened and frozen to a great depth, as though they were caught in a snare. 37. Finally, with pack animals and men exhausted to no purpose, they pitched camp on the crest, and they had a very hard time clearing ground even for this. So much snow had to be dug up and removed. The men were then taken off to make a road down the cliff, which was the only possible way to go on. Solid rock had to be cut. They felled some massive trees in the area, stripped the branches from them, and made a huge pile of logs. This they set on fire when a strong breeze arose suitable for whipping up a blaze, and as the rocks became hot, they made them disintegrate by pouring vinegar on them. After the scorching the cliff face with fires in this way, they opened it up with picks and softened the gradient with short zigzag paths, so that even the elephants, not just the pack animals, could be brought down. 4 days were spent at the cliff, during which the pack animals almost starved to death. The mountain peaks are practically bare, and the snows cover such pasture as there is. The lower regions have valleys, a number of sunny hillocks, and streams with woods close by, a more suitable habitat for humans. There the pack animals were put out to pasture, and the men, exhausted from their road building, were given some rest. It took only 3 days to descend from here into the plains, the environment and the disposition of the inhabitants both being less forbidding. 38. Such were the main features of the journey into Italy. Hannibal reached it in the 5th month after leaving New Carthage, according to some authorities, and after spending 14 days crossing the Alps. There is no argument at all amongst the sources on the size of Hannibal's forces when he crossed into Italy. The highest count is 100,000 infantry and 20,000 cavalry, the lowest 20,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry. The most authoritative account could be that of Lucius Cincius Elementus, who records that he was taken prisoner by Hannibal, but Cincius makes a mess of the numbers by adding in Gauls and Ligurians. With these included, Cincius asserts that the total brought into Italy was 80,000 foot and 10,000 horse, but it is likely, as some authors in fact affirm, that it was within Italy rather than these peoples flocked to Hannibal's banner. Cincius also states that he learned from Hannibal's own lips that he lost 36,000 men and a huge number of horses and other beasts after crossing the Rhone. On coming down into Italy, the people Hannibal reached next were the Turini Semigali. This is universally accepted, which makes me all the more surprised at the dispute over Hannibal's route over the Alps, and at the prevailing belief that he crossed by the Pennine Alps. and that this Alpine range was given its name on that account. I am likewise surprised at Coelius' statement that Hannibal crossed by way of the Cremo Ridge. Both of these passes would have brought Hannibal down not amongst the Turini, but amongst the Libyan Gauls, the route traversing the mountain-dwelling Selaci. Moreover, it is unlikely that those routes to Gaul would have been open at the time, and in any case, those leading to the Pennine Alps would have been blocked by the half-German tribes. And indeed, there is another argument that may have some validity. The Sedonnovaragri, who inhabit that particular alpine range, are unaware of the derivation of the name of those mountains from any crossing of the Carthaginians, and draw it instead from the god whom the mountain people call Poenius, whose cult is established on the highest peak. 39. Very convenient for Hannibal at the start of his campaign was the fact that the war had been launched against the Isubres by the tribe closest to them, the Turini. But Hannibal could not put his force under arms to get assistance to one side or the other. It was now in the process of recovery that his men were experiencing the worst effects of their earlier tribulations. Rest after hardship, plenty after privation, comfort after filth and disease. All this was having very physical effects on men who had been reduced to squalor and near brutalization. This was why the consul Publius Cornelius Scipio hastened towards the Po after reaching Pisa by sea. Even though the army he had taken over from Manlius and Attilius was one of raw recruits demoralized by their recent discreditable performance, he wanted to engage an enemy whose strength was not yet restored. When the consul reached Placentia, however, Hannibal had already moved from his camp, and had taken by storm a single city of the Turini. In fact, the tribal capital, because its people would not willingly enter into an alliance with him. Indeed, he could have enlisted the Gauls living round the Po, who would have come to him of their own accord, and without intimidation, but for the prompt arrival of the consul, who checked them as they sought an opportunity for insurrection. Hannibal then moved from the land of the Turini, in the belief that the Gauls, undecided on which side to support, would in fact support whichever was close at hand. The armies were now most in sight of each other, and two commanders had been brought face to face, who, while yet knowing each other well, felt a certain admiration for the other. Hannibal's name had been very well known to the Romans, even before the destruction of Saguntum, and Hannibal thought Scipio a remarkable man for the sole reason that it was he who had been chosen commander to face him, and their mutual esteem had been increased by recent events. Scipio had been left behind in Gaul, but had come to face Hannibal after his crossing into Italy, and Hannibal had had the nerve to attempt the Alpine crossing, and had actually brought it off. Scipio crossed the Po before Hannibal. He moved his camp to the river Ticinus, and to encourage the men before leading them into battle, proceeded with the following harangue.